They said Walt Halloran had wasted the only real money he ever earned on a hill of dead trees, and at 62, June Halloran had exactly $57.31 to her name, a foreclosure notice folded under the sugar bowl, and a husband 3 weeks in the ground who had left her nothing anybody in the family wanted. That was the whole arithmetic of her life on the morning. It began to change, though she did not yet know it would change, and she would have laughed at you, tired and dry-eyed, if you had told her that the useless thing sitting at the end of a gravel lane in the cold upland light was about to become the most valuable possession she had ever laid a hand on. She stood at the kitchen counter with the notice open in front of her, reading it again as a person reads bad news, as if the words might rearrange themselves into mercy if you gave them enough attention. They did not. The bank wanted what the bank was owed, and June had a checkbook that would not stretch to cover a single month, and gray-streaked hair she had pinned up in a loose, low bun before dawn, because there was no one left to pin it up for. Her hands were steady. That was the strange part. Her whole world had come apart, and her hands were as calm as they had been for 40 years. In the deed envelope, tucked under the thin official paper, there was a second sheet, and this one had not been typed. It was written in Walt's own crabbed hand, the letters leaning hard to the right as they always had, and June had read it enough times already to know it by heart, and she read it once more anyway. "The old trees are the bank," it said. "The book in the cellar is the key. Don't let them cut the orchard, Junie. Promise me." She carried that page folded in the breast pocket of her coat, over her heart, not out of sentiment, but because she did not trust herself not to lose it, and losing the last words a man ever wrote. "You" was the kind of thing that could finish a person. Stay with me all the way to the end of this, because the moment his family finally saw what June uncovered on that hill, their faces said everything their mouths could not hours, and it took a whole season and a stranger from the state to say it out loud. The cider mill sat 5 miles out of town, in a green hollow where the road gave up being paved and became 2 ruts with grass grown up between them. Walt's cousins had already been out to look at it, the same as crows go and stand over a thing lying still in a field. They had taken the good bottom land when Walt's father died, and the tractor, and the level acres a man could actually farm, and they had left Walt the hill, because the hill was, in their careful judgment, 40 acres of firewood. That was the phrase. They said it as you say a word you are proud to have found. 40 acres of firewood, and a broken-down mill nobody had pressed a drop of cider in since before June was a bride. She drove out to see it because you cannot sell a thing you have not looked at. And she meant to sell it, and she meant to be gone by the end of the week. She had a cousin of her own in a town 200 miles south with a spare room and a soft heart, and June figured she would sign the mill over to whichever relative wanted the deadwood, take whatever pennies were offered, and spend her remaining days being somebody's burden in a house that smelled of other people's cooking. That was the plan. It was not a good one. It was the plan of a woman who has stopped expecting good plans. The lane climbed. The trees closed in. And then the trees opened out, and there it stood. For a long moment, June sat in the truck with the engine ticking and looked at the thing her husband had loved more than he had ever managed to say, and something bitter and heavy came up in her throat, because this was it. This was the great secret Walt had guarded and gone on about and refused to sell no matter how the cousins pressed. A stone mill with moss furring the whole north slope of its roof like green fur on a dead animal. Ivy had climbed the gable end and gotten into the mortar and was slowly, patiently pulling the building apart. The great timber water wheel on the flank hung broken, 3 of its paddles gone, the axle seized with rust the color of dried blood. The mill race beside it was dry and choked with a winter's worth of fallen leaves. And behind the mill, crawling up the hill in crooked rows, stood the orchard bare, black, leafless. A graveyard of trees with their arms flung up against a colorless sky. "This is it," she said aloud, to no one in the empty cab. this is what he wouldn't let go of. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and sat there until she was finished, and then she climbed out of the truck. Before we take one step further onto that hill with June, take a moment to subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight, because stories such as hers are meant to be shared with people who understand them. And stay close, because tomorrow I have set aside something even more special for you. Now the door. The mill door was oak, banded with iron, and it was locked, and June carried a ring of old keys Walt had kept on a nail by their own back door for as long as she could recall. Keys she had dusted around 1,000 times and never once asked him about. She stood in the dry mill race with the wind coming down off the hill and tried them one at a time, her breath smoking, until the 7th turned with a groan she felt in her wrist, and the door swung inward on darkness and the smell of old apples and cold stone, and something sweeter underneath, like the ghost of every autumn the building had ever held. Inside, the great press stood in the middle of the floor like a sleeping animal, its screw as thick as a fence post, the oak of the basket gone silver with age. Cobwebs hung in sheets. A rank of grafting knives lay on a workbench against the wall, oiled, clean, their handles worn smooth by a hand June would have known anywhere laid out ready, as if the man who used them had only stepped out a moment and meant to come right back. She stood looking at those knives for a long while. They did not fit the story of a dead mill. A person does not keep grafting knives sharp for firewood. That was the first thing the mill told her, and it would tell her a great many things more before it was through, though on that first evening she had no words at all for what she was being told. She should have left. The light was going. Instead, June found a kerosene lamp on a shelf beside the door, its chimney sooty but whole, and a tin of matches gone soft at the corners, and she lit the lamp because the dark was coming, and because some part of her did not want to leave yet. She carried it deeper into the mill, past the press, to a low door in the back wall that opened onto stone steps going down, and she went down them into the cellar with the light held out ahead of her, and the cousin's verdict ringing in her head, 40 acres of nothing but kindling, and her husband's words folded in her pocket, the book in the cellar is the key. The cellar was dry. That surprised her. A stone cellar cut into a hillside had no business staying dry, and this one was, because somebody had kept the drains clear and the roof over it sound for years, and the somebody was 3 weeks in his grave. There were bins along one wall for storing fruit through the winter, and a workbench, and above the bench a small window at ground level on the uphill side. Its glass wiped clean, a lamp bracket bolted to the wall beside it, and on the bench, wrapped in a square of waxed cloth gone stiff with age, lay a book. June set the lamp down. She unwound the cloth with fingers that were not, now, quite steady. It was a ledger, the sort a shopkeeper keeps, bound in cracked green cloth, and when she opened it the first page was covered in Walt's leaning hand, dated in a year she had been a much younger woman, and it read like nothing she had ever seen. Numbers. Trees numbered as if they were children, rows of dates beside them, and next to the dates words she half knew and half did not cleft: whip, tongue, scion, understock, take, no take, take, little diagrams. A tree drawn in ink, a wedge cut into its sawn-off trunk, a slim shoot fitted into the wedge, and bound with a wrapping he had sketched thread by thread. She turned the pages. 30 years of them. 30 years of a man coming out to a hill everyone called dead and doing something to it, patiently, in secret, season upon season, and setting down every single thing he did. On a back page, loose, was a catalogue leaf gone brown at the edges, an old nurseryman's list, and on it a single variety of apple was circled in that same leaning ink, and beside the circle Walt had written 4 words that stood the hair up on June's arms in the cold cellar, gone since 1890. She did not understand it. Not that night. She understood only that her husband had lied to her for 30 years, not with words. He had never once told her a false thing in his life, but with silence, with a whole hillside of silence. and that the lie had a shape she could not yet see the edges of. She wrapped the ledger back in its cloth and carried it up out of the cellar and out to the truck, and set it on the seat beside her like a passenger, and she did not sell the mill that week after all. Before June opened that ledger, she was a woman with a few crumpled dollars and a plan to disappear. After she opened it, she was something else, though it would take her the better part of a year to learn what, and I want you here for all of it, so take a second right now to subscribe, and then stay close, because what June found in that cellar did not merely change her mind. It changed everything, and it changed it in full view of the very people who had called her inheritance firewood. She rented a room in town, over the hardware store, cheap, and she drove out to the mill every day. She told herself she was tidying it up to sell it better. That was a lie as well, the sort you tell yourself. What she was truly doing was reading her husband page by page, tree by tree, out on the cold hill in her dark work coat, with the iron keys jingling at her hip, learning a language he had spoken his whole life and never once taught her. The trees were numbered. That was the detail that broke her a little. The first cold morning she went up between the trees with the ledger open in her arms. Wired to the low branch of each gnarled, leafless tree was a small brass tag, green now with weather, stamped with a figure, and every figure was in the book, and every tree in the book had a history: the year it was grafted, the stock it was set upon, whether the graft had taken that first spring or failed and been redone. Tree 11 had failed twice and taken on the third try, in a year June remembered because it was the year her mother died and Walt had been strange and quiet all that spring, and now she knew he had been up here, in the cold, coaxing a dead thing to live 3 times over, and never breathed a word. "You stubborn old fool," she said to the empty orchard, and it came out soft, near tender, as you speak to someone you have loved a long while. "What did you do up here?" She found the scion wood in the cellar the second week, in a bin she had taken for empty bundles of slim shoots the length of a pencil, wrapped in the same waxed cloth, each bundle labeled in Walt's hand and packed in damp moss to keep them from drying, dormant, alive, biding time as seeds bided. She held a bundle in her 2 hands in the lamplight and understood, dimly, that she was cradling something living her husband had cut and saved, and meant to graft in a spring he did not live to see. She did not know its value. She thought, then, it was worth nothing but the memory of him, and even that she took for a fool's fortune. The orchard, meanwhile, did the thing June was afraid to hope it would do. Spring came up the hollow slow, and then all at once, and the black leafless graveyard on the hill went first to a haze of green, and then to a snow of blossom, and June stood in the mill race one May morning and wept without deciding to. Because the dead thing was not dead. It had never been dead. It had only been waiting for a season, as she herself felt, some mornings, that she had been waiting, all those gray years, for a season come at last too late and too strange. It was that same May that the first of them drove up the lane with an offer, and here the story stops being about a widow and a mill, and becomes about what the world does to a thing it has decided is worthless the very instant that thing turns out to be worth something after all. Stay with me, subscribe, if you have not, and tell me in the comments whether you have ever watched somebody try to take a thing from a person the moment it stopped being trash, because from this point on the hill was no longer only June's to keep. It was contested. And a found thing, she was about to learn, can be lost again as easily as it was found. The first man drove a silver truck too clean for that road, and he wore a jacket with a company name stitched over the pocket, and he introduced himself as an agent for a development concern, and looked at the mill precisely as the cousins had looked at it, as a problem to be solved. He talked about the hollow. He talked about a road that was coming through, or might be, and about how a person situated as June was, and here he glanced at her worn boots and her dark coat with a soft pity, that made her want to slap him. A person situated as she was might do very well to take a fair offer while a fair offer stood on the table. "How fair?" June said. $9,000, the man said, and smiled as if he had handed her the moon. "For the parcel. We'd clear the hill, of course. The trees, the old mill, it's all a liability the way it stands. Insurance nightmare. But that's our concern, not yours. You'd walk away clean." $9,000. To a woman who had counted $57 3 months before, it was a figure with a gravity of its own, and June felt it pull at her, felt the whole tired weight of her wanting to say yes, and be done, and be safe. She thought of the notice under the sugar bowl. She thought of the room over the hardware store and the cousin 200 miles south. And then she thought of Tree 11, grafted 3 times in the spring her mother died, and of the 4 words in brown ink about an apple lost since the last century, and she heard herself say a thing she had not planned to say. "You'd clear the hill," she repeated, "every stick of it. Do you a favor, honestly, no?" June said. "Thank you." "No." The man's smile did not so much fall as curdle. He left a card. He said offers of this kind did not sit on the table forever, and that she ought to think hard about her situation, and he said the word situation again as you would touch a bruise, and then he drove his 2 clean truck back down the lane, and June stood in the dry mill race with her heart pounding and thought, "What in God's name are you doing, June Halloran? Turning down $9,000 you do not have." That evening she did a thing she had not done since Walt died. She went down into the cellar, and she lit the lamp, and she set it in the bracket by the clean little window, and she opened the ledger on the workbench, and she wrote in it, in her own round hand beneath 30 years of his leaning one. "A man came today to cut it down," she wrote. "I told him no. I don't know why. You'd better be right, Walt." And she sat with that light steady in the small clean glass while the dark came down the hollow, never knowing that Walt had set a flame in that same glass every autumn of his life, so that anyone coming down the hill road in the dark would spy one warm point of light, in a place the world had written off a habit she had just repeated without a soul to teach it to. Her. The nursery buyer came the following week, and he was worse, because he knew exactly what he was looking at and pretended he did not. He was a lean, pleasant man with a clipboard, and he strolled the orchard beside June and made small sounds of professional regret over the age of the trees and the state of the mill. And then he offered her his word of courtesy. He would take the scion wood off her hands, the bundles in the cellar, the prunings off the trees. Sticker wood, he called it, waving a hand at the orchard as though brushing away a smell. Old feral stuff, no commercial variety anybody's grown in 2 generations. But I've a few sentimental customers, heritage types. I could do you $40 for the lot and haul it off myself. Save you the bother. $40. For the lot. June looked at this pleasant-lying man and understood, in a slow, cold flush, that he knew perfectly well what the wood was and was trying to steal it from a widow he had taken for a fool, and she smiled at him as you smile at a snake you have decided not to fear. "That's generous," she said. "Let me think on it." "Don't think too long," he said. "Wood like that dries out, loses all its value." And he seemed not to hear the joke he had made, and June did not point it out to him, and she watched him drive off too, and then she went and stood before tree number 1, the oldest and most gnarled of them all, and she said, "He wanted the wood, Walt. He knew. He knew, and he lied to me." What is it? What did you grow up here that a man would drive out and lie for the sake of $40? The tree, being a tree, said nothing, but June was beginning to grasp that her husband had left the answer set down, and that the whole game, the developer's 9,000, the buyer's 40, was that everyone who came up the lane knew a thing June did not, and was racing to seize the hill before she found it out. So she quit cleaning the mill to sell it. She began reading the ledger to keep it, and she took the old catalog leaf with its circle and its 4 brown words into town, to the little county library, and she asked the woman at the desk where a person went to learn about an apple that was supposed to have vanished the better part of 100 years ago. That is where the state came into it, and where the thing on the hill stopped being June's private grief and started to become public, by evidence, as the truest kind of vindication always arrives. Stay with me, this is where it turns. Subscribe now if you want to see how it lands, because what a stranger from the State Agricultural College said in front of the whole town that autumn is the reason June Halloran's name is still spoken in that hollow, and it had nothing whatever to do with money. The librarian did not know, but the librarian knew who might, and she wrote a name on a card, and June wrote a letter, plain and honest, describing the ledger and the numbered trees and the circled variety in the 4 brown words, and she posted it with a stamp she could scarcely spare, and for 3 weeks she heard nothing, and she went on setting the light in the cellar window of an evening, and she went on grafting, because that was the other thing that had happened. June had learned to graft. She had learned it out of the ledger, as you learn anything when you have no one to teach you, and all the time in the world, and a dead man's careful diagrams before you, and it had gone badly at first. Her early cuts were clumsy. The bindings loose, the scions dried out before she got them set, but Walt had written down his failures too. Tree 11 grafted 3 times. And there was comfort in that, in knowing the stubborn old fool had failed, and gone back, and failed, and gone back, and so she failed and went back, and one warm afternoon in the orchard, she cut a clean wedge into an understock, and fitted a slim labeled scion into it, and bound it thread by thread as the sketch showed, and stepped away. And something in her chest that had been clenched since the funeral came quietly loose. There, she said to nobody. There, like that. That's how you did it, isn't it? It was around then that an old man began coming up the lane on foot, twice a week, an ancient fellow named Orrin Teasdale, who lived down the hollow and had known Walt his whole life. The first time, June found him standing at the edge of the orchard with his hat in his hands, looking up the rows as a man looks at a grave, and she went out to him wary, because she had grown wary of everyone who came up that road. "You'd be Walt's June," the old man said. It was not a question. "I'm Orrin. I brung the deadfall down off the top acre for him, autumns, when his back went bad. Figured I'd carry on, if it's all the same to you." He'd not have wanted them boughs left to rot on the ground. Why would he care about deadfall on a hill of dead trees? June said, watching him. Orrin looked at her a moment, and something crossed his old face, careful, the look of a man deciding how much he was allowed to say. "They ain't dead," he said finally. "You've been up here months. You know they ain't dead." "I know they bloomed," June said. "I don't know what they are." "No." He worked the brim of his hat around and around. "No. He wouldn't have told you. He didn't tell me either. Not the whole of it. But I'll tell you what I know, Mrs. And it's this. 30 year I watched that man come up here in weather that keep a sensible person by the stove, and cut, and tie, and bury his little bundles in the cellar, and never once let me set foot inside the mill door. 30 year. And one time, only the once, I asked him straight out. I said, "Walt, what in the Lord's name are you doing up here that's worth your knees and your name and every daylight hour you've got?" You know what he told me? "Tell me," June said, and her voice had gone quiet. He said, "Orrin, I'm keeping a promise nobody knows I made." The old man's eyes were wet, and he did not wipe them. That's all. That's the whole of what he'd say. A promise nobody knows I made. And then he'd laugh and hand me the saw, and we'd not speak of it again till the next fall. I figured it was grief, some ways. A man his father shorted, cousins that cheated him, working a dead orchard out of pure stubbornness. I thought he was daft, Mrs., and I loved him, and I helped him be daft. That's the truth. June stood very still. It wasn't grief, she said, and it wasn't daft. No, Orrin said. I don't reckon it was. A man doesn't keep a book on a thing that don't matter, and I seen him writing in that book by lamplight more nights than I can count. Whatever's up here, Mrs., he wrote it all down. Every stick of it. He set his hat back on his head. You find out what it is, you come tell old Orrin. I've waited 30 year to know. And he went up the top acre and gathered the fallen boughs as he had done for a dead man, and June watched him go and understood that the hill had handed her one more clue without handing over its whole, meaning a promise nobody knew Walt had made, and that the answer was still in that dry cellar, still in the book. Waiting. The man from the state arrived at the end of a rainy August, and he was not what June had pictured. He was young, or young to her eyes, with mud on his boots when he stepped down, which she liked, and a habit of going quiet in front of the trees that she liked even more, because a man who falls silent before a thing is a man who respects it. He walked the rows with the ledger and made no small sounds of regret. He made no sound at all for the longest time. And then he stopped at tree number 1, the oldest, and laid his hand flat against its trunk, and June saw that his hand was not quite steady, and she thought, oh, so it is true, whatever it is. Mrs. Halloran, he said, and his voice had gone careful. Do you know what these are? I know my husband kept them alive for 30 years, June said. I know a man tried to buy the cuttings off me for $40 and lied to my face while he did it. I know the words he wrote in the book, gone since 1890. That's all I know. You tell me the rest of it. The young man looked at the hill, at the crooked rows climbing it, at the mill with its broken wheel and its ivy, and he said a name, the name that had been circled in brown ink, and then he said the thing June had come the whole grieving distance to hear. This variety was declared extinct, he said, 100 years back, or near enough. It was a famous cider apple once. Oh, true, there are records of it, prices, whole orchards of it. Oh, true. And then blight and fashion and the war took the orchards, and nobody kept the wood, and by the time anyone thought to look for it again, there was nothing left. Not a tree, not a graft. It's down in the books as lost. There are people who have spent entire careers hunting apples like this, chasing a rumor of one old tree in a fence row, a name painted on a barn, and coming home empty-handed. He turned and looked at her, and his young face was full of something that was not quite disbelief and not quite awe. And your husband had a whole orchard of it, numbered, dated, every graft recorded, every parent tree traced back. This is no firewood, Mrs. Halloran. This is a rediscovery. This is the sort of thing that brings a variety back from the dead. And the book makes it real. The book is the proof. You cannot certify a rediscovery on a rumor. On this you can. He touched the green ledger as a man touches something in a church. A tree can die, but you cannot lose one that somebody troubled to write down. June stood very still in the wet grass. Say that once more, she said. A tree can go into the ground and rot, the young man said, and a variety can go extinct, and the world can forget it entirely. But if one man keeps the wood alive and writes down where it came from and every single thing he did to it then it is not lost. It is only waiting. That is what your husband did. He kept it waiting. And June Halloran, 62-years-old widow, who had counted out $57 3 seasons gone, put her weathered hand over her mouth, and understood, at last, the shape of the silence her husband had kept for 30 years, though the whole of why still lay beyond her. And the why was the final thing, and it was waiting for her too, down in the cellar, where Walt had left it. Stay with me, because we are nearly to the part that matters most, the part that is not about apples or money at all. Subscribe now and stay close. What followed was, in one light, only paperwork, and in another, the sky coming open. The young man came back with older men from the college, and they walked the rows and took cuttings and pored over the ledger for hours, and grew very quiet and very careful with June, as people are careful with something rare, and word got out as word does in a small county, o Oriu. First a whisper, then a paragraph in the county paper, then a photograph on the front page of a gray-haired woman in a dark work coat standing before a stone mill, a ring of iron keys hanging in her hand at her side, and behind her, climbing the slope, the rows of trees that everyone in 3 townships had called firewood. The certification came through that fall. The variety, officially, was no longer extinct. It existed. It existed in exactly one place on earth. On a hillside, a man's own cousins had offered to take off his widow's hands, and the sole reason it could be proven to exist, the sole reason a university would stake its name on the claim, was a green cloth ledger in a dry cellar, written in a leaning hand, 30 years deep. And then the value everyone had lied about came due, all at once, in the open, where June had no need to say a single word in her own defense. A nursery, a real one, a serious one, not the pleasant thief with his clipboard, licensed the right to propagate from the orchard's scion wood, and because no other source of it existed anywhere in the world, the wood a man had offered June $40 for was suddenly worth more per bundle than the developer had bid for the entire parcel. A cidery that pressed single-variety heritage cider signed a contract for the first pressing off the mill's own trees. A cider no living soul had tasted in 100 years, and they paid for the privilege of being the ones to bring it back. In one season, the licensing and the first pressing and the certification together accomplished what $57 and a foreclosure notice had sworn could never be done. June Halloran paid off the farm. She paid off the mill and the hill, and every last one of those 40 acres the family had dismissed, free and clear, in a single autumn, and had money left over and never once raised her voice to do any of it. The developer's agent tried to come back around. Naturally, he heard, as they hear, and he drove his 2-clean truck up the lane once more with a fresh number, a bigger one, and June met him in the mill race and did not invite him in. "My answer is the same as before," she said, "only now I understand it better than I did. You wanted to clear the hill. There's a thing growing up on that hill that people gave whole lives to hunting and never found, and my husband had it under his hat the entire while, and you would have bulldozed it flat for a road that isn't even coming through. So no, not for 9,000. Not for 90. It isn't for sale, and it isn't for cutting. And if you want to know why, you can read about it in the paper along with everybody else." And she stood there in her dark coat with the keys in her fist until he climbed back into his truck, and that was the last June ever saw of the man. The nursery buyer with the clipboard she never saw again at all. He needed no telling. He read the county paper the same as anyone, and a man who tries to lift a fortune off a widow for the price of $40 does not come back to shake her hand once the fortune turns out real. He was undone by the plain truth of it, in public, by evidence and by no speech of June's, which is the only kind of undoing that ever truly holds. And the cousins who had taken the bottomland and the tractor and the level acres and left Walt his firewood, the cousins read about it too, at their own kitchen tables, over their own coffee, a gray-haired woman on the front page before the mill they had laughed at. And the article laid out what the place was worth now, and it printed the word rediscovery, and it quoted a line the college pomologist had given a reporter, that you cannot lose a tree somebody bothered to write down. June did not gloat. She was asked more than once whether she meant to say anything to them, and she said no, she did not, because the trees had said it on her behalf, and the paper had said it, and there was nothing her mouth could add that their own faces had not already told them when they opened that page over breakfast. She had watched the family look at the hill as a nuisance. She did not need to watch them look at it as a fortune. It was enough to know that they had, and that they knew she knew it. But none of that, not the money, not the certification, not the developer sent packing, nor the cousins reading their paper, none of it is the thing this story is truly about, and June found the thing it is about on a cold evening late that first autumn, alone, down in the cellar, with the flame lit in the window. She had gone down to put the season's new scion wood into the fruit bins to pack it in damp moss as Walt's diagrams laid out, dormant and labeled, alive and biding. And in the very back of the deepest bin, behind the last of the bundles, her fingers found a flat tin she had never noticed, shoved far into the dark, and she drew it out and wiped the dust from its lid and worked it open, and inside, folded once, lay a letter in Walt's leaning hand, and her own name was written on the front of it. Junie, just that. The name only he had ever called her. She sat down on the cellar step with the lamp beside her and read it, and this is what her husband had written, in some autumn she would never be able to date, and left in the dark for the day she would need it most. Junie, it said, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you found the book, and you know by now what the trees are. I never told you because I couldn't, not because I didn't trust you, because I was afraid that if I said it out loud, said plain what they were, somebody would want them, and want them wrong to sell, to fence, to own, and the whole point of the thing was that nobody could own an orchard like this. They could only keep it. So, I kept it 30 years, quiet, up on a hill my own family laughed at, and I let them laugh, because their laughing kept it safe. But I wasn't keeping it for the apples, Junie, I want you to hear that. I've watched us grow old. I've watched the money not come, and the good years not come, and I've laid awake nights knowing that if I went first you'd be left with nothing but a bank that wanted paying and a family that wouldn't lift a hand for you. So I grew you a bank instead. That's what the hill is. It's a bank, and it's been filling up slow for 30 years while everybody thought it was dying, and the day you had nothing left, you'd walk up that hill and find out you had more than any of them, and it would be a thing they couldn't take and couldn't even understand. Because you'd have earned it just by keeping faith with it. It was always yours, Junie. I only kept the roots warm until you were ready for it. Don't let them cut the orchard. Graft the next ones yourself. You'll have learned how by the time you read this, you're too stubborn not to have. Light the lamp in the cellar window come fall, so that anybody lost in the hollow sees one warm light burning. And when they ask you how a dead orchard came back to life, you tell them the honest truth of it. You can't kill a tree that somebody wrote down. I love you. I always did. Look up the hill some evening, and you'll see I never once left it. June sat on the cold step a long while with the letter in her lap and the light steady in the window, and no tears came, though you would have forgiven her for them. She looked instead, as he had told her to, up through the small clean glass at the dark shape of the hill against the last of the light, at the rows of trees she now knew every one by number. And she understood the whole of it at last, that the worth of what Walt had left her had never once been the money. Though the money had come and saved the roof above her head, the worth was that out of all the world, out of a family that would have sold it for scrap, he had chosen her. He had trusted her, and her alone, to be the one who kept the light of the orchard burning. That was the true inheritance, not the trees. The trust. She folded the letter back into its tin, and she set it where she would always know where to find it, and she climbed the stone steps and blew out nothing, because she left the flame alight in that glass, as he had every autumn of his own life, and as she meant to every autumn of the rest of hers. The mill wheel turned again the following fall, at the harvest festival. June had the broken paddles replaced, and the seized axle freed by a man in town who remembered when the mill still ran, and on a bright cold October day, with half the county come out to witness the impossible thing, the apple that had been dead 100 years pressed into cider on the very hill where it had refused to die, June Halloran opened the sluice and let the water down the mill race. And the great wheel groaned, and turned, and the press came down, and the first golden run of a cider no living person had ever tasted spilled into the tub, and the crowd in the hollow went quiet, as people go quiet before something they will tell their grandchildren about. The pomologist was there, older now by a year and prouder than he had any claim to be, and he asked June if she would say a few words, and she did not much want to, but she stepped up onto the mill race wall in her dark work coat, with her gray hair coming loose from its bun and the ring of iron keys still, out of long habit, hanging at her side. And she looked out at all the faces, some of them the cousins' faces, come out with everyone else to see. "My husband kept these trees for 30 years and never told a living soul," she said. "People called it firewood, called him a fool. I called him worse than that a few times myself, God forgive me, before I understood him." A gentle ripple of laughter went through the crowd. But he wrote it all down. Every tree, every graft, every failure, and every one that took hold. And because he set it down on paper, a thing everybody swore was gone forever turned out only to have been waiting. She paused, and her steady voice did not shake, though it might have. "So I'll tell you what the fellow from the college told me, standing right up there beside the oldest tree, and I mean to keep telling it as long as I've got breath in me. You cannot kill a thing that somebody troubled to write down. You cannot. Not if one stubborn person keeps faith with it in the dark. That is all my husband ever was, a stubborn man who kept faith. And that, I've come to think, is all any of us are ever asked to be." And she stepped down off the wall, and the wheel turned, and the cider ran gold in the cold light. And up on the slope the trees that the whole county had written off stood in their crooked rows, alive, numbered, biding the next spring as patiently as they had bided this one. Old Orrin Teasdale was in the crowd, of course, his hat in his hands, and when the pressing was done, June carried a cup of the first run over to him herself, through all the people, and put it in his old hands. "You waited 30 years to know," she said. "Here it is. Taste what he was keeping." The old man drank, and his eyes filled, and he did not wipe them this time either. "That's it," he said, his voice gone rough. "That's the promise nobody knew he made. Lord, he was keeping the whole world a secret up here, and he let me think he was daft." He laughed, and it broke a little. "Daftest man I ever loved. You tell him, if you get where he is before I do, you tell him Orrin finally tasted it, and it was worth every winter." "I'll tell him," June said, and meant it, and the two of them stood in the loud bright crowd and drank a cider that had been dead for 100 years, and said nothing more. Because nothing more needed saying. June grafted the next generation herself, the spring that followed, alone in the orchard with the ledger open on a stump beside her, cutting clean wedges into fresh understock and fitting in the slim labeled scions and binding them thread by thread as the sketches showed, adding her own round hand to 30 years of his leaning one, setting down each tree, each date, each take, and each no-take, so that 100 years on, when she and Walt and every last soul who had laughed were long gone to dust, the trees would still be standing, because somebody had bothered to write them down. Here's the thing I want to leave with you, before you go, and it is worth more than any orchard. The price of a thing and the worth of a thing are not the same, and the world will spend your whole life trying to persuade you that they are. They will look at what you love and name it firewood, because they cannot see the roots you have kept warm, the faith you have kept in the dark, the thing you have written down and refused to let be lost. A developer offered June $9,000 to bulldoze a treasure he could not see. A dealer offered her $40 for a fortune he was too greedy to name honestly. And a dead man, who had never in his life had much money to leave anyone, left his widow the one thing that could not be bought or bulldozed or stolen, a living bank upon a hill, and the trust to keep it, and the sure knowledge that out of every soul on earth he had chosen her. Perhaps there is a thing in your own life that somebody has told you is worthless. A house, a habit, a hope, an old promise you made to someone who is gone, and perhaps you have half believed them. I want to tell you tonight what June learned on that cold hill with a near-empty purse, a broken heart, and a book in a cellar. Keep faith with it. Write it down. Keep the roots warm, Because you can't kill a tree that somebody wrote down, and you never truly know, until the season finally comes around, which of the dead-looking things you have been faithfully tending was quietly, all along, the very thing that was going to save you. If this story warmed something in you tonight, do me the kindness of subscribing, and turn on the bell, so the next one finds its way to you. There are 2 more stories waiting for you right here on your screen, chosen for hearts such as yours, and I hope you will stay a while longer with me. Until then, light the lamp in the window. Somebody out there in the dark hollow is searching for one warm point of light, and it might as well be yours.